Well, it is a Tuesday, and as we do every week, we take time to focus on some key developments taking place on the continent. You could say that a common theme on all our stories this evening relates to the long-held idea that many African leaders tend to hang on to power because they don't want to face the music for any wrongdoing that might be exposed after they leave. Well, tonight we're going to look at how this is playing itself out in countries as diverse as Liberia, Angola and Zimbabwe. We're joined now for our discussion by Simon Alison, who is the Africa editor at The Mail and Guardian. Good evening to you, and thank you so much for coming in. I mean, in all three countries that we're going to be focusing on tonight, there is this air of optimism, if you like, in terms of leadership changes, but also a sense, albeit in very different ways, some of the old skeletons are tumbling out, are they not?
You know, it's amazing how optimistic we are as humans. Every time there is change, we think, oh, this change is going to be good change. And I think we're especially seeing that in Zimbabwe, where President Emmerson Mnangagwa is certainly being given the benefit of the doubt. We're seeing it in Angola, where President Lorenzo has come in. He's shaken things up a little bit, and people are saying, oh, now everything's different, everything's better. And in Liberia, too, there's a new president, President George Weah, of course, the former football player turned
FIFA Player of the Year.
FIFA Player of the Year. Luka Modric might be president one day. He won the FIFA Player of the Year last night, I believe. And what we kind of should be looking very carefully at is how much of this optimism is justified. And I think there's a few concerns that we have looking at all three of these countries.
Yes, I mean, look, the devil, as you know, is always in the details. Let's start with Liberia. George Weah really inheriting what you could call a broken country, depleted by political malfeasance, civil wars, continuing outbreaks of Ebola, and now, of course, the latest issue is that of the missing millions. What on earth is going on there?
This is quite an extraordinary story. So 104 million US dollars worth of freshly printed crisp Liberian dollar notes arrived in several batches at the port and then poof, disappeared, gone. It might be one of the greatest robberies in human history. One day they're going to make a movie about what exactly happened to that cash, but right now no one knows what happened to that cash, and of course all the politicians are trying to blame each other, saying it wasn't them, saying they know nothing about it. And George Weah finds himself in a very difficult position because the first consignment apparently arrived last year, before he was president. But the second consignment arrived a couple of months ago when he was president.
I mean, it's a tricky one because, of course, as you're seeing even in our screen, protests on the street, a number of people pointing the finger at Weah himself. Others are saying that it's the son of the former president, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, her son Charles.
Absolutely, and you know, his name has come up before in relation to corruption scandals, in relation to nepotism scandals, so he certainly doesn't have a very clean record. But at the same time, there's no evidence really being presented by anybody for who it actually is. And you do have to wonder, what are the chances of a properly independent investigation in a country like Liberia?
I mean, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, of course, as we know, Africa's first democratically elected female leader, a two-term president, the last recipient of the Mo Ibrahim Prize for African Leadership. As you say, the name of her son Charles has come up before, but there is this idea that she tended to look away whenever his name came up.
You know, we sent one of our reporters to interview Ellen Johnson Sirleaf shortly before she left office. And we posed that question to her. We said, come on, you brag about your clean record, but you've got your sons in key positions, they've got all these scandals. And the answer she gave was along the lines of, well, you know what, I have so much to deal with that I cannot be in sort of, not everything can be perfect. It can't all be perfect. I'm doing the best I can, and I need all the support that I can get. And it was a very interesting answer because she's not necessarily wrong. You know, these are very difficult countries with very limited resources. So there is a case to be made, but it certainly does raise questions about her administration.
Let's go to Angola. Of course, I mean, a year is a very short time, but tomorrow will be marking a year since João Lorenzo became president of Angola. There was the sense that he'd been handpicked by his predecessor, Eduardo dos Santos, but since coming to the presidency, he's been on this clean-up campaign, and among his targets, the children of the former president, Isabel, and now Filomeno dos Santos.
It is quite extraordinary. I think we all thought, okay, José Eduardo dos Santos has carefully stage managed this transition to ease himself out of power, but keep a tight grip on the sort of financial elements of the economy, the Sovereign Wealth Fund and the Sonangol, the oil company. His children were in charge of that. But João Lorenzo has proved to be his own man, and he is slowly reeling in the power from the dos Santos family. And the news today that José Filomeno dos Santos, the son who used to be in charge of the Sovereign Wealth Fund, that he is actually wanted in custody to face charges in relation to an irregular $500 million transaction. This is quite extraordinary. And I'm very mixed on what this means, because on the one hand, of course, accountability is really important. And we need corrupt leaders, whoever they are, to be held accountable for that kind of thing. On the other hand, what José Eduardo dos Santos was doing in stepping down peacefully and smoothly and with stability was kind of being held up as a role model for other dictators, other presidents who've stayed in power for too long.
Now they're going to say, look at him, we don't dare do the same.
Exactly.
The cynic could also say João Lorenzo is perhaps not doing so much of a clean-up, but maybe consolidating his own rule.
Absolutely, and that is always the question with these sort of corruption purges, is who gets purged, and how much of it is just a convenient excuse. And that's why you often see them in the first couple of years of any new president's reign. We saw it with Muhammadu Buhari in Nigeria for the first couple of years, and then suddenly those corruption cases seemed to go away because he'd kind of dealt with his enemies and he didn't want too much looking into his own administration. And I think we're likely to see the same pattern unfold in Angola.
But just talk to me in terms of the figures. I mean, we know what state capture is estimated to have cost in South Africa. We know, of course, Dos Santos was in power, for nearly 40 years. How much damage was done to that country's economy?
You know, I think it is incalculable. And it really does pale in state capture in South Africa pales in comparison with what has happened in Angola over decades. I mean, Isabel dos Santos was, and I believe she still is, Africa's richest woman. And she is worth hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars. Now, how did she do this? Does it so happen that the president's daughter is this incredible entrepreneurial genius, or did she have a little bit of help along the way?
Because almost all her business interests are aligned in some way or another to business with the state.
Exactly. It is almost impossible to separate the Dos Santos family from the sort of commercial dealings of the state and state-owned enterprises, and that is really what Lorenzo is trying to unravel. And we'll see if he sort of creates a new, more transparent regime once he has wrestled back control, or if he puts his own men and women in charge of those key positions.
All right, you've already alluded to this in this interview already, but let's hop and skip across the Limpopo to Zimbabwe. And of course, years of mismanagement by the Mugabe regime there really brought that country to an almost ruinous state. It's not all going to change overnight, is it?
No, you know, it's, I read the latest figures, and if you have $190 US dollars in your bank account, that will only get you $100 of real cash. That's how much actual hard cash is costing in Zimbabwe, because there is so little of it. And it really is quite an extraordinary reversal. You remember sort of a decade ago when the Zimbabwean financial crisis first hit in earnest, and there were all those pictures of sort of wheelbarrows of cash. The issue was too much cash, and it destroyed the economy. The issue now is the exact opposite. Too little cash. And what's happening? It's destroying the economy. Neither pole is really an effective recipe for prosperity, and Zimbabweans are suffering. The price of bread rose 10% this week, and it's already very expensive. If inflation continues at that kind of pace, we could be looking at a serious disaster in Zimbabwe. And here's the thing. is the new government, the elections that brought Emmerson Mnangagwa into power for a first full term. They were meant to open the doors for billions of dollars of investment, and investors were said to be queuing up. All he had to do was deliver a relatively credible election. And unfortunately for the Zimbabwean people, he doesn't seem to have pulled that off.
Well, I mean, let's ask the question, what has he done in practical terms to send real signals that he's reversing the legacy of the Mugabe years? Because it isn't just going to be the euphoria of his election. People want real assurances that they won't be duped again.
Exactly. He's got the nice Zimbabwean scarf, and he says, goes touring and says Zimbabwe is open for business. But he's not making the hard changes yet that need to be made. He is not, and the main issue really is his relationship with the military. Because the question is, how much is Zimbabwe really a military state? Is it controlled by the generals that, of course, orchestrated the coup that ousted Mugabe himself? And until investors are pretty reassured that Zimbabwe is in fact a democracy and is not being run behind the scenes by the generals, I don't think they're going to be willing to put their money there.
But there are some encouraging signs. I mean, a reduced cabinet is made sure to hire technocrats, for example, people who are particularly skilled in terms of the portfolios they've been appointed to. Those are welcome.
Yeah, those are very good signs. But of course, the cabinet's only as powerful as the state in which it operates. And we don't know yet whether Zimbabwe is a state that the cabinet is really going to have full authority over, that even Emmerson Mnangagwa has full authority over. Remember the violence which happened the Wednesday after the election, when 6 people were killed in Harare as the tanks came into the streets. Now, no one thinks that Emmerson Mnangagwa wanted that to happen. It didn't make any real sense. So the question is, does he have enough control to keep the troops in line, to keep the other elements of the state doing what they're supposed to be doing and not doing their own thing? And we haven't answered that question yet. And I think until we do, the money is going to stay away.
So rising prices, a surging black market. The spectre of Robert Mugabe still looms large over that country, even though he himself isn't pulling the levers of power directly.
Absolutely. And, we've been talking about presidential progeny in Liberia and Angola, and it's been fascinating for me. I follow Robert Mugabe's 2 sons on Instagram, and it is quite a remarkable feed of champagne and high-end stores and a jet-setting lifestyle that doesn't seem to have changed at all since he was ousted from power. And for me, that's a very interesting sort of anecdotal symbol that even though on the surface lots of things have changed in Zimbabwe, in practice the same people are still doing the same things.
I think there's a lot of questions to be asked about lessons for South Africa, given our own new dawn and our own euphoria at the changes that have been taking place in South Africa. Simon Alison, thank you very much for your perspective and your analysis as we look at the dominating stories on the continent. That's, of course, the Mail and Guardian's Africa editor, Simon Alison, who is, of course, here in studio for our Tuesday feature, Eye on Africa.